London, 1857. The city wakes slowly, blanketed in a low gray mist that clings to chimneys and cobblestone streets. Horses' hooves echo faintly through alleys still slick from the night's rain. Behind closed doors, candles flicker to life and hearths groan with the weight of a new day. Somewhere along a quiet side street, just far enough from the gaslit boulevards of the wealthy, sits a narrow townhouse with clean curtains and a polished brass knocker. Nothing about it stands out. No signs, no red lanterns. Yet inside, life begins not with the rustle of silk ball gowns or the ringing of silver spoons, but with the sound of a woman exhaling into the cold. This is not the story of queens in corsets. This is the story of survival. Welcome to the quiet, often unseen world of women in Victorian London who lived between the cracks of respectability. This is the beginning of one such woman's day, a woman known to her clients only by a soft smile or a chosen name, but who carries the weight of decisions no one else dared make. Her bed is not feathered. Her fireplace burns low. Her mornings begin before the sun. Not with leisure, but with labor. The blanket she clutches is thin. The mattress beneath her lumpy, stuffed with coarse horsehair. Her breath hangs in the air like mist as she pulls on a faded dress and breaks the ice on the water. In the wash basin, no one romanticizes this kind of waking, not in the books, not in the history lessons. But it was real. It mattered. And for many women, it was the only choice left when the seamstress shops closed. The factories turned them away, and the promise of a better future became a luxury they could no longer afford. In this house, discretion is currency. The women here have learned how to smile just enough, to laugh just right, to carry themselves like porcelain and steel all at once. Their job is not just what it seems. They are actresses, listeners, secret keepers, and, more than anything, survivors. Every detail of their day is managed with precision: how they speak, how they dress, even how they breathe when certain footsteps approach the door. This story is not about judgment. It is about reality, about resilience, about understanding the human cost of being invisible in a society that demands silence from its most vulnerable. If you find this hidden side of history as fascinating as we do, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These are stories rarely told, not because they lack meaning, but because they make us look a little too closely at the world we built. Let us explore them together. So settle in. Take a deep breath. We are about to walk through one day in the life of a woman history forgot, but who deserves to be remembered. The morning light crept slowly into the room, filtered through a thin muslin curtain that barely softened the stark gray of the London sky. It was not sunlight in the warm sense. It was more a reminder that another day had arrived, uninvited, like a tax collector, or the lingering scent of last night's coal smoke. The woman stirred beneath a linen sheet that had long since lost its softness, its fibers stiffened by overuse and poor laundering. The air in the room was cold, biting, heavy with dampness and the faint, sour tang of mildew. She pulled the blanket tighter, a threadbare thing that barely held the heat she had managed to hoard through the night. Beneath her was the same horsehair mattress she had slept on for years, a lumpy, uneven slab that poked and sagged in places depending on where it had been worn thin. It was not comfort she sought in the mornings. It was habit, familiarity, a routine that reminded her she had, at the very least, survived the night. The mattress groaned softly as she shifted, stretching limbs stiff from the cold, reaching instinctively toward the small iron stove in the corner of the room. It had burned out hours ago, its glow now just a memory. She had only a few lumps of coal left, not enough for waste. She would save them for later, when the chill set deeper into her bones. The room itself was sparse. A wash basin with a cracked edge stood beside a chipped mirror. Her dress faded green with a mended hem hung neatly from a hook on the door. Every item had a purpose, and nothing was owned without need. The floorboards creaked as she rose, bare feet brushing against the rough wooden slats. The window was already fogging with the difference between the room's cold and the outside's colder. She ran her fingers along the glass, clearing a patch wide enough to see the street below, where a carriage passed slowly, wheels muffled by the wet cobblestones. A man in a top hat walked briskly beneath his umbrella, heading toward some meeting or appointment that would not concern her. This was the quiet between acts, the moment before the day's performance began. She moved to the basin, where water waited in a porcelain jug, crusted with mineral lines from too many refills. It was cold, but she splashed it on her face anyway, gasping slightly at the shock of it. The mirror stared back at her, a woman neither old nor young, caught in that vague middle ground where hardship carves its mark before time does. Her eyes were alert, brown and steady, framed by dark lashes that needed no enhancement. Her hands, though slender, bore calluses from work, just not the kind of work society approved of. She did not speak aloud. There was no one to speak to. In this house, words were often saved for clients, not mornings. Downstairs, the house was beginning to stir. She could hear faint footsteps, the low hum of conversation, the clinking of glass and porcelain as the others prepared themselves. Each woman had her own routine, but the rhythm was familiar, a chorus of movement and silence. They were never loud in the mornings. They respected each other's spaces, perhaps because they knew how little space they were truly afforded in the world. She dressed quickly, the green fabric brushing against her skin with a whisper, cinching it at the waist with a ribbon that had once been blue. Her boots were scuffed, but they fit. A touch of rouge, a slight adjustment to her hair, and she became someone else, someone polished, composed, ready. Ready to smile when expected, to listen when spoken to laugh at jokes that were not funny, and to offer comfort that often was not returned. This house was not one of the infamous dens of sin that the newspapers decried in moral panics. It was clean, discreet, and managed with discipline. The madam kept things orderly, and the clients, mostly respectable or at least predictable. They came from Parliament, from the city, from homes with wives and servants and locked drawers. They arrived not seeking pleasure alone, but escape from duty, from control, from the masks they wore in daylight. She knew them, their secrets, their fears, their lies. Some came just to talk, to be touched gently, to cry when the whiskey set in. Others brought gifts, small tokens of guilt or affection. She rarely kept. She learned early never to mistake attention for care, or intimacy for safety. Still, in this fragile economy of emotion and flesh, she had carved out something resembling stability. Not freedom, perhaps, but a kind of choice. That mattered. The air downstairs was warmer, scented faintly with lavender water and coal smoke. The parlor would soon be opened, curtains drawn back just enough to let in light, without inviting curiosity. The women would take their places, books in hand or embroidery half finished, pretending to be merely at leisure. It was theater, every moment of it, and she had become a master of the stage. But for now, in the quiet, she allowed herself one last glance out the window, watching the morning deepen into day. Somewhere beyond this street, people were already forgetting how easily a woman could be pushed to the margins. But she remembered, and she carried that memory into every smile, every laugh, every gesture practiced to perfection. History may not have written her name, but this was her life, and it was real. She rose slowly, limbs stiff from the cold that lingered in the early morning air. The lumpy horsehair mattress beneath her had offered little comfort through the night, its form molded by years of use, and the stale linen sheets clung to her like a damp, second skin. The coal fire had long since died out, leaving only a faint trace of warmth in the dim room with peeling wallpaper and frosted window panes. Still, she did not complain there was work to be done, and routine was both a necessity and a balm. Sliding her feet into worn slippers, she crossed the creaky wooden floor to the small basin near the corner. The water inside was frigid, almost painful to the touch. But she had no choice. She splashed it onto her face and arms, gasping as the chill struck her skin, rubbing briskly with a cloth that had once been white but was now more threadbare than clean. There was no time for lingering, no luxury of warmth or comfort. Everything was brisk, practical, and quiet. The other girls were still rousing themselves in the neighboring rooms, their footsteps echoing faintly as the brothel stirred to life. She dressed quickly, pulling on the modest undergarments and the simple house dress worn before clients arrived. Her fingers worked swiftly on buttons, smoothing creases, ensuring neatness. Appearances mattered, even in the unseen moments. The day's tasks would not wait for her to lament the cold or the ache in her bones. She tied her apron around her waist and stepped out into the hallway, greeted by the muted hum of daily chores beginning somewhere below. The madam was already shouting about someone forgetting to sweep the parlor the night before. The morning routine was familiar. She moved to the front room, cloth in hand, dusting surfaces polished by years of effort. The smell of coal, smoke, perfume, and old wood filled her nose, a scent she had come to associate with a strange blend of survival and endurance. Her fingers brushed along carved banisters, candle holders, the tops of picture frames that held fading portraits of long dead patrons and stylized sketches that hinted at elegance in a life that often had little room for it. Downstairs in the kitchen, the cook was grumbling about the quality of the bread delivered that morning, but the promise of a small pot of real coffee lifted everyone's mood. It was a luxury, one of the few small joys that came not from extravagance, but from the memory of better things. She sat at the long table with the others, hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup, savoring each sip like it was a treasure. The warmth spread through her chest, momentarily dulling the cold, and she allowed herself a quiet smile as someone cracked a dry joke about the weather or the clientele. Breakfast was sparse, a heel of bread, a sliver of salted meat, and a smear of butter if they were lucky. But there was comfort in the company. These women were not just co-workers, but survivors. Each with their own story, carved by circumstance and choices they rarely got to make freely. There was a rhythm to these mornings that brought a strange kind of peace, even if the peace was brittle, easily broken by a knock at the door or the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Still, she held on to those brief moments, the warmth of coffee in her belly, the soft hum of conversation, the way the light filtered through the curtains in patterns that reminded her of home. She did not speak of the past often, nor did the others, but it clung to them all in silent ways, shaping how they moved, how they laughed, how they survived. And in that fragile silence, surrounded by clatter and chatter and the sharp scent of morning coal, she found the courage to face another day. Though the morning sunlight did little to warm the narrow alley where the discreet townhouse stood, inside its walls there existed a curious blend of routine and ritual. It may have been a brothel in name, but in function it resembled more a household driven by quiet discipline and subtle choreography. The walls, thick, lined with dark wainscoting, muted the sounds of the city beyond. In this hidden world, life ticked to its own rhythm, unaffected by the raucous chaos of London's outer quarters. By the time the first kettle hissed in the kitchen, the women had already begun their day, not with extravagance or indulgence, but with the small, repetitive tasks that grounded their lives. The scent of starch and coal lingered in the halls, a quiet testament to early morning chores completed without instruction. The main character, having braced against the shock of cold water and tightened the laces of a modest bodice, moved through the corridors with practiced ease. Her fingers, red from scrubbing, now traced the polished edge of a hallway table, dusting without fanfare. It was not servitude, but part of the house's culture, a place where dignity clung to every polished banister and carefully lit candle. Breakfast, when it came, was modest, but precious. A thick slice of bread, some salted butter, and a rare indulgence. A pot of real coffee brought an almost sacred silence to the shared table. The girls sat close, their conversation light, sometimes teasing, sometimes reflective. Though their pasts were varied, some orphaned by disease, others escaping harsh marriages or the endless grind of factory life here, they were equals. The structure of the house gave them purpose, a sense of place. It was not spoken aloud, but the unspoken professionalism among them created its own kind of safety, as though the walls themselves demanded a kind of dignity rarely afforded women of their station. Clients were not yet expected. The early hours were for the house alone. In these moments, one could forget the nature of the business, especially when the parlor was filled with the scent of lilacs arranged fresh by the madam herself. She, ever punctual and poised, believed in presentation clean linens, trimmed lamps, polished brass, and insisted the women hold their posture not just for clients but for themselves. There was no room for sloppiness here. Every glance, every gesture, every garment was part of a delicate equilibrium she had spent years mastering. To outsiders, a brothel was a place of shame. But for those within these walls, it was something more nuanced. It was a fragile ecosystem of survival, strategy, and moments of rare comfort. The hierarchy within was understood. The rules were not written, but everyone abided by them. New girls learned quickly not because they were scolded, but because the rhythm of the place demanded it. Those who thrived were the ones who listened to footsteps on the stair, to changes in the madam's tone, to the way clients glanced toward the mantel clock. In this peculiar sanctuary, the main character found something close to rhythm, even if not peace. She folded a handkerchief just so, refilled a water jug, swept a corner the housemaid missed. Outside, the world pressed in with its soot and scrutiny. But inside, a curious grace had taken root one, born not of luxury, but of order, mutual respect, and survival. By understanding the quiet power of composure, the morning light filtered weakly through the gauze-draped windows as she stood quietly in line with the other girls, the familiar creak of floorboards and muffled footsteps filling the hall. The scent of soap still lingered faintly on her skin, though the cold water earlier had made her shiver to her core. Now they waited, not in fear, but in practiced patience for the physician's weekly visit. His tools were kept in a small leather bag, always meticulously cleaned. Though his manner was impersonal and brief, there was a strange comfort in the ritual of it all. A reminder that their well-being, at least within these walls, was treated with a certain degree of seriousness. The doctor greeted the madam first, tipping his hat politely, and began his rounds in the parlor where the girls had gathered, dressed modestly in their day frocks, hair-pinned and neat. One by one, they stepped behind the folding screen, where he would examine them for signs of illness, fatigue, or anything that might place the house or its reputation at risk. The procedure was clinical, efficient, and devoid of cruelty. It was not affection or kindness they sought in that cold stethoscope or those gloved hands, but rather confirmation that they were well enough to work, that their bodies were still reliable vessels in a world that demanded so much from them. For her, it was always the same, the soft thump of her heartbeat under his hand, the perfunctory nod and the swift scribble in his ledger. She dressed again in silence and rejoined the others by the hearth, where warm tea waited in chipped porcelain cups. The house, for all its secrets, ran like clockwork. Cleanliness was not just habit, it was necessity. Illness, after all, could destroy a business faster than scandal. And here, scandal was already an invisible guest. The inspections reminded her of the fine line they walked each day. They were not prisoners, nor were they entirely free. The city outside pulsed with life and danger, with chimneys that smoked day and night, and streets crowded with horse-drawn carriages and newsboys shouting headlines. But inside this house there was order, there were rules, a kind of uneasy sanctuary wrapped in velvet drapes and perfumed air, and beneath it all, a shared understanding among the girls. They may not have chosen this life in the way others chose a trade or marriage, but they lived it with intention, with grace where possible, with dignity where permitted. The inspections, strange as they seemed to outsiders, were part of maintaining a fragile sense of control in a world that rarely offered any. After the doctor left, the parlor would warm again with quiet chatter. Someone would hum a melody from the music hall down on Bow Street. Another would slip upstairs to mend a fraying hem or fix her curls. Life went on, not with glamour or glory, but with a kind of muted resilience that marked every moment inside those painted walls, and though the world outside labeled them with crude names and dismissed them with moral scorn, inside this house they moved like a delicate machine, each inspection, each chore, each glance from the madam a cog in a system that allowed them, however fleetingly, to exist on their own terms. By late afternoon, the air inside the drawing room had changed. The scent of coal smoke mingled with delicate floral perfume as the lamps were lit and the velvet curtains drawn, veiling the modest house in warm golden shadows. The women, already well into their second round of tea, were quietly preparing for the evening ahead, not with haste or anxiety, but with the quiet precision of practiced routine. There was a rhythm to this place, a tempo they all moved to, and tonight would be no different. She glanced toward the mirror, tilting her chin just so, practicing a demure smile. It was not vanity that guided the motion, but purpose. Each woman here knew she was part of an illusion, carefully crafted for the clientele, an illusion built not only of lace and lamplight, but of elegance, eloquence, and restraint. They were not merely present to fulfill a service, but to fulfill a fantasy, often one built less on desire and more on the yearning for sophistication, status, or escape. They each had their roles. One might adopt the air of a French courtesan, fluttering her fan and slipping into a feigned accent when guests entered. Another might embody the reserved charm of an upper-class widow, soft-spoken with eyes that lingered just long enough to provoke curiosity. It was performance, certainly, but also a defense mechanism, a line between self and persona that allowed them to endure the repetition of nightly encounters without losing what was left of their inner world. She had learned, in time, how to shape herself into what was needed. A refined tilt of the head, a slower cadence of speech, a touch of poetry when asked about books or art. Clients often came with expectations, many rooted in romanticized notions of what such a woman ought to be. To match those ideals was to secure comfort, security, and, if only for a short while, safety. Behind closed doors, the interactions were rarely crude. The house cultivated discretion, and with it came a certain kind of client men who wanted not vulgarity, but connection masquerading as affection. They wished to feel desired, admired, even understood, and so the women listened attentively, adjusted their laughter to the man's temperament, and spoke with grace, regardless of their own emotions. It was exhausting, yes, but also empowering in an odd way to know precisely what to say, to soften a hard mood or coax a smile from a dour guest. Sometimes, though, they were caught off guard. A client's grief might surface without warning, or his anger might simmer just beneath pleasantries. That is when the art of performance mattered most. They would draw upon their training, never formal, but learn through experience, and redirect the energy, offer a story, shift the conversation, adjust posture, dilute tension with a gentle joke or a well-timed compliment. It was more than role play. It was survival, wrapped in velvet and lit by candlelight. And through it all, they maintained their dignity, even when others refused to see it. When the night ended and the clients were gone, they would peel off their personas like silk gloves and return to themselves, tired perhaps, but still whole. Upstairs, in the quiet of her small room, she would sit by the narrow window and watch the gaslights flicker on the street below. Her hands still bore the scent of lavender soap. She would sip cool tea, remove hairpins one by one, and allow the hush to wrap around her like a second skin. Another day done. Another performance survived. And tomorrow, it would begin again with the same careful precision, the same quiet strength, and the same unwavering control over how much of herself she gave away. Not every visitor who crossed the discreet threshold of the establishment came with the same intentions. Some carried themselves with nervous hesitation, their eyes darting across the wallpapered corridors, fumbling with gloves or hat brims, whispering apologies as if they were trespassing into a holy place. These were often first-timers, young clerks, widowers, or boys barely out of adolescence, nudged into manhood by the suggestion of older co-workers or the weight of isolation in a city too vast to embrace them. The girls, trained in both poise and patience, could spot them the moment they stepped through the door. They knew to soften their voices, to offer reassurance without words, to guide rather than perform. For these men, the experience was not always about desire. Sometimes it was about curiosity, confusion, or simply the yearning to be touched without judgment. And then there were the regulars, the ones whose boots left familiar imprints on the stairs, and whose scent lingered faintly in the parlor, long after they were gone. These men came not merely for pleasure, but for ritual, for comfort, and sometimes, in rare moments of vulnerability, for something dangerously close to companionship. Some arrived after long days of trading or negotiating, weary from noise and expectation, content to sit in silence beside a woman who would not demand cleverness or coin beyond what had already been agreed. Others talked endlessly, weaving stories about the worlds they navigated, some grandiose, others surprisingly small, unraveling the frayed ends of their thoughts to anyone willing to listen. For them, these visits were less about the body and more about the illusion of being known. Of course, not every encounter left a trace. Many were brisk, transactional, choreographed down to the final breath. The door closed. Shoes scuffed the floor. Hands moved quickly and without sentiment. And then it was over a brief interruption in the night's procession of shadowed figures. For the women, these moments were not without meaning, but neither did they linger. They were folded into memory like countless others, indistinct and unburdened. Still, it would be wrong to suggest that these rooms were devoid of authenticity. Beneath the soft flicker of gaslight and behind the velvet curtains, there were moments brief, fragile, where masks slipped and something startlingly human emerged. A man pressing a coin into a hand with trembling fingers, his eyes glassy from some unspoken grief. A woman laughing unexpectedly at a shared joke, the kind of laughter that came not from obligation but genuine delight, a goodbye that lasted a beat too long. These were the moments that could not be rehearsed. They did not appear in training, nor could they be summoned on command. They simply happened, like fog rolling in across the Thames, unbidden, and strangely beautiful. Outside, the world continued in its indifferent rhythm, cobblestones clattering with carriage wheels, lamplighters making their rounds, the city swelling with steam and soot. Inside, within those painted walls and perfumed rooms, a parallel world pulsed quietly, unacknowledged by polite society, but no less real. And within that world, the main character learned to navigate the ever-shifting tide of human need. Not with cynicism, but with a kind of resigned grace. Some clients asked for stories, some for silence, some cried, others came simply to feel the warmth of another body nearby. And in that house, beneath its practiced elegance and ritualized routine, the women carried the weight of it all, wrapped in satin and secrets. By the time the last door creaked shut and the house began to settle into its nightly hush, the main character would retreat to her modest room, the stale linen now oddly comforting, the mattress as familiar as her own shadow. She would exhale slowly, letting the residue of the day slip from her shoulders like a shawl, and stare at the cracked ceiling with the knowledge that, come morning, it would all begin again. Before all this, before the heavy perfume and the finely rehearsed smiles, before the creaking floors of this dim house and the soft knock of men at midnight, she was a seamstress. Not one of grandeur or fashion, she stitched hems for housemaids, mended coats for coalmen, and sometimes, when she got lucky, embroidered initials into handkerchiefs for young gentlemen who never knew her name. Her hands, now accustomed to velvet gloves and rouge pots, once bore needle pricks and threads too fine for old eyes to see. The work was honest, grueling but honest. It demanded patience, precision, and a kind of quiet pride she carried like a pin in her apron. She remembers sitting by the window of her attic room, squinting in the wan light as the seasons changed outside. Winter made the threads stiff, and her fingers cracked from the cold. Summer brought dust and sweat and more orders, as ladies prepared for garden walks and parties she would never attend. But London was unkind to the poor and crueler still to women alone. When her landlady raised the rent again, and clients started bringing their mending to younger hands, the thread of her life frayed. She tried to hold on, sold the kettle, pawned her boots, skipped meals. Dignity, however, does not pay in shillings. And pride, like hunger, can only gnaw for so long before it breaks. The transition did not happen all at once. There was not a singular fall, no dramatic unraveling. It was a quiet descent, built on whispered suggestions, on looks exchanged in back alleys, on promises from girls who had long since stopped using their real names. One night, her stomach twisting from a third day without food, she walked down a road she had always avoided and knocked on. A door that did not have a sign. Madame opened it. She did not smile, but she did not slam it either. Her eyes scanned the girl's frayed shawl, the dirt under her nails, the fear behind her eyes. "Have you ever served tea properly?" she asked. The girl nodded. "Can you sing?" She shook her head. "Then you will learn to listen instead." And so it began. That was over a year ago. The world she lives in now is quieter than people imagine. Not the loud, raucous halls of cheap thrill, but rather a place of control and routine. A house with rules. Sheets changed after every guest, no shouting, no drinking on duty, no secrets from Madame. She keeps her old thimble in a tin box under the bed. Sometimes, when the house is still and her bones ache from pretending, she takes it out, rolls it between her fingers, and imagines a different life. One where the scent of hot linen and lavender soap was not something she had to fake, where her hands still stitched dreams into fabric rather than facades into evenings. Sometimes clients ask what she did before this. She never lies. "I was a seamstress," she says, looking them in the eye. Some nod politely and move on. Others press further. "Why stop?" they ask. She shrugs. Because sewing does not fill an empty stomach. It is not a tale of tragedy. Not in her eyes. Just survival. There are no illusions here. No fantasies of rescue. No romanticism in the red velvet curtains, or the polished brass knobs on each door. She does not hope for escape. She hopes for warmth, for meals that do not taste like desperation, for laughter that does not sound like performance. Each night she brushes her hair precisely 100 times. Not because she believes it will bring beauty, but because routine gives her power. She folds her nightgown carefully, sets her slippers beside the bed, and sleeps with her window cracked slightly open. The city air is filthy, but it reminds her the world outside still exists. She dreams sometimes of cloth between her fingers, the tug of thread, the crinkle of muslin, the way fabric would sigh when cut cleanly across the grain. In those dreams, no one is watching her. No one is touching her. She is alone in peace, and the needle never slips. When the doors are closed and the silence settles like dust over the parlor, the women retreat into their second world, one without clients, without role play, where they are just themselves, stripped of painted smiles and curated charm. It is in this space, tucked between working hours and evening appointments, that the women tend to the small rituals of their lives. The rooms echo, not with seduction, but with scrubbing brushes and fabric slapping against washboards. Laundry, always a looming chore, is tackled communally. Dresses are rinsed and wrung, bodices repaired, garters stitched by hand under the dim light from the windows, which barely pierce the haze from the coal fires. The air smells of soap and starch, sometimes mingled with the faint trace of a perfume that stubbornly clings to everything. It is here, amid warm basins of water, drying linens and creaking floorboards, that conversation flows freely. There is laughter, soft and fleeting. There are sighs, more frequent. But above all, there is talk that serves not just as camaraderie, but as a quiet network of information vital for survival. They speak in coded tones, swapping stories not of romance, but of caution. A certain gentleman caller who becomes too forceful after a drink. Another who demands silence and pays generously for it. Some of the women have memorized names, addresses, even occupations of their most frequent patrons, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Knowing who to trust and who to avoid is a form of currency in itself. And so gossip becomes more than idle chatter. It becomes insurance. Among them, the main character, the seamstress-turned-working woman, sits cross-legged on a low stool, mending a frayed hem with methodical precision. She does not speak much unless spoken to, but when she does, the others listen. Her story is not uncommon in outline, but it holds a certain weight. She speaks of how her fingers once danced over silk and muslin, tailoring gowns for women who now walk past her on the street without a glance. There was no dramatic fall from grace, just a slow erosion. A sick mother, missed rent, too many days without work, and finally, an offer she once swore she would never take. Now, sewing is a comfort, something she can control, in a world where so little is. Though the setting may suggest glamour to an outsider, the velvet drapes, the ornate mirrors, the flicker of candlelight, it is a house of commerce at its core. The illusion is for sale, not lived. The girls know this better than anyone, and behind closed doors they peel it away like layers of old wallpaper. Their camaraderie is not always tender, but it is reliable. If one girl disappears from her room too long, another will knock. If a new face enters, she is quietly briefed on how things really work. These moments, lived in the margins of their profession, are where their humanity asserts itself most clearly. They talk about home, about dreams they once had, about the days when their names still belonged only to themselves. Some still send letters, others have stopped altogether. But here, together, with sleeves rolled up and hands in warm water, they rebuild tiny fragments of dignity, not from grandeur, but from routine. The scrubbing of a petticoat, the care taken in braiding each other's hair, the whispered joke shared when they know no one is listening. And while the world outside may label them harshly, within the confines of this house, they have built a rhythm, an uneasy sort of harmony. They know the toll of their work, but they also know each other. They recognize when a girl is too tired to speak, or when one's silence masks something heavier. There are no counselors here, but there are arms that reach out without words. Shoulders offered in the quiet way only people with shared burdens can offer. Safety, too, is a communal effort. From shared warnings about violent men to memorizing each other's client schedules, they create a web of watchfulness. It is not foolproof, but it is better than isolation. When one of them returns from a visit pale and shaken, the others do not pry. Instead, someone brings her tea. Someone else fetches clean clothes. They absorb each other's pain in fragments, letting it dissipate slowly into the creaking walls and worn floorboards. These women, often dismissed as broken or fallen, show a kind of strength the outside world rarely acknowledges. They endure, not because they are hardened, but because they have learned to bend without breaking. They work, they clean, they whisper, and they wait for a better day, a kinder client, or the courage to leave. And when the next knock comes at the parlor door and the lamps are lit, once again they return to their roles with practiced grace, voices lowered, shoulders straightened, faces set like porcelain masks. But in the spaces between the cleaning, the folding, the soft sharing of warnings and tea, they are simply women trying to survive. And that, above all, binds them together. Sometimes, on a quiet morning when the streets were just beginning to stir, she would take her shawl, wrap it tightly around her shoulders, and slip outside. It was not to run errands or meet anyone, just a brief step into a world that once might have been hers. Her destination was always the same, a small bakery 2 alleys down, where the scent of warm dough drifted into the cold air. With a few coins tucked into her glove, she would buy a jam tart, something modest but sweet, and sit by the window, pretending for a few precious minutes that she was simply another working woman starting her day. Outside the brothel walls, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. There were laundry girls hanging damp linens, shopkeepers brushing snow from their doorsteps, and young boys chasing after bread carts. Nobody paid her much attention, though occasionally a glance lingered too long a woman alone, not quite dressed like a servant, not quite noble either. Respectable society did not know where to place her, and in truth, neither did she. The jam tart tasted like childhood memories, soft, with a hint of strawberries that reminded her of a countryside summer. As she nibbled at it carefully, she watched others with a longing that was not quite jealousy. She did not crave their routines or even their lives. What she craved was simplicity, the ability to be in a public place, without judgment, without whispers, just another face in the crowd. But that luxury was no longer hers, not since she would traded a needle and thread for survival. She had once sewn hems for ladies who would never know her name. Her fingers remembered the weight of silk and the ache from long hours spent hunched under poor lighting. She had loved the craft, even the solitude of it. But as wages shrank and landlords grew impatient, choice gave way to necessity. The house where she lived now was not glamorous, but it kept her warm, it fed her. And unlike the seamstress workshop, here her earnings were enough to send something home, just a few shillings tucked into envelopes, marked with false names. The other women called her Quiet Girl, not because she was shy, but because she did not offer stories unless asked. Still, she listened. And over shared tea, laughter, or the occasional tear, they bonded in ways that only those who live parallel lives can. They gossiped about clients not in cruelty, but in caution. Which man had a temper? Which one paid generously? Who lingered too long? These whispered exchanges were a form of insurance. Knowledge here was currency, and sharing it meant safety. Back in the house, life was rigidly structured. Mornings were for chores. Each woman was responsible for her linens, her clothes, and her corner of the room. The scent of soap and starch filled the corridors as they laundered the traces of the night before. Afternoons brought a lull. Some used the time to sleep. Others wrote letters they never sent. And when dusk fell, the transformation began. Voices softened. Gowns were chosen with care, and each woman prepared for her role. They did not become someone else entirely, but rather a version of themselves molded to match expectation. She, for instance, had learned to tilt her head just so, to speak gently but with enough confidence to seem refined. One man liked to believe she was the daughter of a disgraced nobleman. Another preferred thinking she had grown up reading Latin poetry in the drawing rooms of philosophers. These stories were not lies exactly. They were crafted personas, designed to offer something more than a transaction. It was not love they sold, but illusion, safety, and sometimes even companionship. Of course, not every encounter was so polished. Some men came nervous, eyes darting, voice cracking, unsure how to act. Others were stern and silent, treating the moment as something mechanical and forgettable. And yet there were times rare, but unforgettable, when a client came not for pleasure, but for comfort. A recent widow, unable to sleep alone. A soldier between deployments, too shaken to speak. On those nights, humanity pierced the performance, and silence said more than practice lines ever could. Her health, like the others, was regularly checked by a discreet doctor. It was a matter of business, not kindness. Clean women meant safer clients, fewer risks, and a stronger reputation for the house. Still, she appreciated the certainty. In a life where little could be predicted, the routine of these visits became oddly comforting. They were reminders that she still had a body to care for, still had agency, even if limited. And then, as the week wore on, there came the moments like this one, sitting by the bakery window, tart in hand, coat drawn close. She would watch people rush past, not knowing they were being watched. Her gaze was not bitter. She did not envy them. She simply observed people who could walk into any room and not be asked, "Why are you here?" That freedom, invisible to those who had it, was the most valuable thing she could imagine. When the tart was gone and the teacup empty, she would return. Past the alley, through the courtyard, and up the narrow stairs that led to the only place that was hers. There she would wash her hands with care, fold the shawl as if it were made of gold, and prepare for another night, another face, another story. And perhaps tomorrow, if the weather held and coins allowed, she would do it again, venture out not for rebellion, but for remembrance. A brief echo of who she might have been, and a quiet reminder that behind every mask is a woman who once dreamed of something else. As dusk settles over the narrow alleyways and cobbled streets, the brothel shifts from quiet routine to delicate anticipation. Gaslights flicker to life, casting a warm, golden glow on velvet drapes and polished wood floors. The parlor undergoes its nightly transformation from a place of casual routine into a theatrical stage. Candles are lit, curtains adjusted just so. Perfume lingers in the air, and soft music hums in the background. It is not luxury, but it is effort, an illusion of warmth that clients are willing to pay for. The women, too, begin to shift. Gone are the moments of rest and reflection from earlier in the day. They reapply their rouge, smooth their skirts, and rehearse their smiles in the mirrors. Some murmur softly to one another about returning customers, what they like, what to avoid. Others glance anxiously at the clock, bracing for the unknown. This is not just a job, it is a performance, a dance between expectation and self-preservation. Clients arrive, one by one. A familiar gentleman with graying sideburns offers a tip before even crossing the threshold. He always comes on Thursdays, and always asks for the same girl. Another is new, young, fidgeting, nervous, his eyes darting about the parlor as if trying to reconcile the fantasy in his head with the reality before him. The madam greets each with practiced ease, pairing them with the appropriate companion. Age, demeanor, purpose, she calculates swiftly. This is a business built not just on bodies, but on perception and control. For the women, Each night is unpredictable. Some encounters are brief and businesslike. Others linger with surprising tenderness. There are regulars who return not only for company, but for familiarity, even a sense of affection. One might bring flowers. Another might speak of his wife who passed years ago, needing someone to simply listen. In those moments, the line between transaction and human connection blurs, not erased, but softened. Among them, the main character, quiet, observant, moves with practiced calm. She prepares herself carefully, every motion deliberate. Once, she was a seamstress, stitching delicate lace and hemming skirts for women of means. But the economic downturn, the sickness that took her father, and the landlord who refused to wait at all led her here. Not by desire, but by necessity. There is no glamour in this life, only realism. A roof overhead, meals on the table, and a fragile sense of control over her own fate. Between clients, there are brief pockets of reprieve. In those moments, the women clean their rooms, tend to their garments, and gather in the shared space downstairs. There, laughter occasionally breaks the monotony. They gossip not just for amusement, but for safety, sharing details about clients, warning signs, subtle behaviors that might indicate danger. It is community, shaped by necessity, held together by mutual care. On some days, when coins allow, and the weather is not too cruel, she ventures out. One afternoon, cloaked modestly to avoid unwelcome attention, she buys a small jam tart from the baker's boy who never meets her eyes. Sitting on a low wall, she eats slowly, savoring the sweetness. It is a rare moment, a small defiance against the weight of her circumstance. Yet even here, among townspeople going about their day, she remains apart. The invisible barrier of judgment surrounds her. Respectable women pass by without a glance. Shopkeepers who once welcomed her now serve her in silence. She understands the cost of her choices, though they were never truly choices at all. As the evening deepens, the parlor becomes its own world. Voices soften to match the glow of the lights. The women step into the roles expected of them, not just companions, but actresses, mind readers, and muses. They adapt their voices, posture, and mannerisms to each visitor, shaping themselves to fit whatever version of intimacy is sought. One girl pretends to be a nobleman's wife. Another plays the witty barmaid. The goal is always the same, to make the experience feel less like commerce, more like longing fulfilled. Yet behind the soft touches and rehearsed laughter lies an unspoken truth. Each woman guards a piece of herself, a fragment left untouched by the parade of faces. The performance may be convincing, but the boundaries are real. What they sell is not love, nor surrender. It is time, borrowed and wrapped in illusion. Still, the humanity remains. A nervous boy may be offered a gentle word and a steadying hand. A grieving man might weep into someone's shoulder. In a place built on performance, there are moments that break through the script, brief, fragile, but undeniably human. When the night finally draws to a close, shoes are kicked off, corsets loosened, and silence stretches through the halls. The women retreat to their rooms, exhausted not only by the physical toll, but by the effort of constant adaptation. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the lives lived behind these heavy curtains. And tomorrow, they will do it all again. The house is finally still. Gaslights have been dimmed, their amber glow flickering softly like memories refusing to die out. Outside, the streets grow quiet, save for the echo of distant hooves or the occasional shout of a night patrol. Inside, she moves slowly, her limbs heavy, not just from labor, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. The perfume and laughter, the careful posture and calculated touch, all of it slips off like a second skin. As she returns to the attic room, she calls her own. She does not light a candle. There is no need. She knows every inch of this room, how the floor creaks near the window, how the roof leaks in spring, how the wallpaper curls in the corner like it is trying to escape. She sits on the bed, still in her corset, and lets herself breathe without an audience. In the dark, there is no role to play, no client to please, only the self she left behind a long time ago. Her fingers move instinctively to the fabric beside her, a piece of cotton she has been hemming for days. A reminder of who she used to be, a seamstress with steady hands and simple dreams. The needle pricks her finger, and she watches the bead of blood rise. It is strange how even that feels more honest than anything else she has done all day. She thinks of the tart she bought earlier, how the sweetness lingered on her tongue longer than she expected. A moment of pleasure so small yet so real. She thinks of the other women, of the girl who giggled too loud tonight, of the older one who hid a bruise with makeup and silence. She thinks of the man who looked her in the eyes and said nothing, and the one who cried into her shoulder like a child. Lying back on the bed, she closes her eyes. But the thoughts do not stop. They drift, they circle, they ask questions that have no answers. What if she had said no? Years ago, what if the factory had paid more? What if the man she once loved had stayed? The possibilities are endless, but none of them change where she is now. Still, she dreams, quietly, fearfully, of a cottage by the sea, of a table with bread she made herself, of waking up to no knocks on the door. Dreams are dangerous things here. They make the mornings harder, but they are also the only thing no one can take from her. A whisper breaks the silence, another girl, in the next room, murmuring about Paris, about saving enough to leave. It is not the first time someone said it, and it won't be the last, but in this moment it does not feel like a lie. It feels like hope, trying to survive in the margins. She lets herself believe it. Just for tonight. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this quiet, hard, and honest journey. If this story touched something in you, made you pause, reflect, or even just feel, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Every story matters, even the ones told in the dark. Sleep well wherever you are, and may your dreams be gentle tonight.